The faces surface without moving their lips, yet the agent hears them clearly, each one calling out a name they should not know. They ask for help. They speak of a place. They speak of a graduating class. The nature of what waits beneath the water and why one researcher insists it be forgotten is documented later in this file. The subject, referred to in transcript only by the string, "You do not recognize the bodies in the water," continues describing the faces observed in the water. Faces, the subject states, "My friends." Faces I recognized, some I didn't, but they became more familiar as I saw them. I'd known them my whole life, but there was something wrong with them. Dr. Harrison prompts the subject to clarify. "Wrong with them?" the subject responds. "Like the face of someone you see in a dream, or you can't remember it right. There's something wrong. And the way they were speaking, Dr. Harrison interrupts. "Speaking? No, that's impossible. They're simply not..." The subject continues over the interruption. "Not moving their mouths, but I could hear them, asking for help. They told me who they were. They told me you knew who they were, that you..." Dr. Harrison again interrupts, instructing the subject to stop, and states that the subject is clearly succumbing to the cognitohazard and that medical attention is required. The doctor addresses the subject as agent and begins to issue a further instruction which is cut off. At this point in the transcript, the speaker designation shifts. Where the subject had previously been logged under a single string, the identifier now repeats, reading, "You, me." The subject's speech grows agitated. "Get your hands off of me. I know all their names, Harrison. I heard them speaking to me. Every single one. All it takes is one person to see them and tell people, and they'll know what you've been trying to hide." Kirk Lawnwood High School, class of... The subject's statement is truncated. Dr. Harrison issues the following instructions in rapid succession. "Subdue them. Get them out of here. Take them to amnestics and turn that goddamn recorder off." The transcript ends here. Following the end of the log, the document presents a bracketed directive addressed to the reader. The directive requests that the reader repeat a following phrase, slowly and clearly, into their terminal microphone. The phrase itself is withheld from this section of the file and appears in material to be reviewed subsequently. The phrase, disclosed at this stage of the file for the purpose of verification, is as follows. "I do not recognize the bodies in the water." Personnel are instructed to repeat this phrase slowly and clearly into the terminal microphone. Upon successful recitation, the terminal returns the notation that verification is complete and that the user's cognitive resistance value is within acceptable limits. Access to further material is then permitted. What follows, under the standard header, is the designation of the anomaly itself. The object is cataloged as SCP-2316. Its object class is Euclid. Special containment procedures are recorded as follows. Under no circumstances are Foundation personnel to approach SCP-2316. Observation of SCP-2316 must only be carried out by remote dummy probes utilizing video and audio recording equipment. Only those personnel adequately rated for exposure to cognitohazardous anomalies may review footage and audio of SCP-2316. The containment directive is notable for its prohibition on direct approach without qualification. No provision is made in this section for eventual retrieval, sampling, or entry by staff of any clearance level. Observation is limited to unmanned platforms, and review of the resulting footage is itself restricted to personnel whose cognitive resistance has been formally certified as sufficient for exposure to hazards of this category. Readers will note that the verification procedure described above is not merely a preface to the file, but functions as a component of ongoing containment. The instruction to repeat the phrase and the phrase itself together constitute a working element of the protective architecture surrounding SCP-2316. To read further is, by the terms of the file, to have already declared that one does not recognize the bodies in the water. With the verification satisfied, the object designation established, and the general containment posture set out, the file proceeds to a description of SCP-2316 itself, of its location, and of the events recorded there by remote instrumentation. That material is reserved for the sections that follow. Personnel who at any point during the review of this file experience unfamiliar recognition, involuntary vocalization, or the impression of having seen the subject matter previously are reminded of the standing instruction preceding this section and are advised to remain calm and to await the arrival of medical staff. Behavioral studies of SCP-2316 indicate that any attempt to come into direct contact with instances, whether by entering the waters of Lake Redacted or by making physical contact with an instance, will result in the appearance of further instances. The recovered documentation notes, at this point in the file, the recurring statement that you do not recognize the bodies in the water. The additional instances do not act physically upon the affected individual. Their function, as inferred from recovered incident reports, is to reinforce and to add to the strength of the associated cognitohazard, thereby compelling the affected individual into the lake. A marginal annotation of uncertain origin and presented within the file itself poses the question of how one could fail to recognize the bodies in the water. Individuals who enter the lake under the influence of this compulsion are considered lost. To date, none have been recovered. Appended to the main document is Addendum 2316.1, designated as an interview. The introductory portion of this addendum has been marked as Data Expunged. Interposed within the expunged section, and again of uncertain origin, is the statement that they do not wish to show you, but that the annotator will, and that the relevant material lies below. This is followed by a verification error indicating an unrecognized user, a request to log in, and a sequence of corrupted characters interrupting the prompt. Within the corrupted string, the phrase, "Let me show you their faces," is legible. The log then begins. The interviewing officer is identified as Dr. Harrison. The interview subject is designated within the transcript by a single, unbroken string reading, "You do not recognize the bodies in the water." Dr. Harrison asks whether the subject ever felt compelled to enter the water, as though something were pulling the subject in. The subject responds, "What? No, of course not. There is nothing wrong with them. They did not drag me in. I saw them in the water and went in myself. I needed to see them. I wanted to hear what they were saying. They are my friends." Dr. Harrison then asks what the subject saw upon entering the water. Appended to this question, within the transcript itself, is the recurring statement that you do not recognize the bodies in the water. The statement does not appear only once. It is repeated in the transcript, and in its repetition, it inverts. The record preserves both forms in sequence, presented without editorial mediation. The first reads, "I do not recognize the bodies in the water." The second, following immediately, reads, "I recognize the bodies in the water." The two lines are given equal weight within the document, neither corrected against the other, neither struck through. No annotation clarifies which was spoken first, or whether both were spoken at all. The contradiction is preserved as if it were itself the intended content. Following these paired statements, the transcript is interrupted by what appears to be a system message of the kind ordinarily produced by internal Foundation terminals during credential checks. The message is marked with a failure indicator. It reads that verification is incomplete. It states that the user's credential rating value is not within acceptable limits. It states that the user's credential rating value is being influenced by active cognitohazards. It then instructs the user to please stay still and advises that a member of the user's site's medical staff will be with them shortly. The final portion of this instruction does not resolve cleanly. Partway through the phrase referring to medical staff, the text degrades. a run of characters follows in which punctuation, numerals, and slashes are interleaved with fragments of the preceding words. The corruption is confined to the terminal message and does not spread backward into the earlier transcript. Whether the degradation reflects a genuine failure of the recording apparatus, an artifact of the anomaly, or an intentional element of the document itself is not addressed within the excerpt. The entry then concludes with a single bracketed notation set apart from the surrounding text. It reads, "Terminal lockout." No further transcript follows. No response from the subject is recorded. No indication is given as to whether medical staff attended, whether the lockout was resolved, or whether the session simply ended at this point. The excerpt terminates on the notation, and the reader is left with the paired contradictory statements, the failed verification, the corrupted instruction to remain still, and the closure of the terminal, presented in that order and without further commentary from the compiling authority. The second addendum opens with a header that repeats the word "below" in an unbroken chain, marked internally as an invalid entry. Beneath this header, the file transitions into a collapsible block whose visible label has degraded into partial terminal formatting characters, and whose contents no longer present as a foundation document, but as a direct address, unsigned, framed within nested brackets. The address begins with an assertion that the reader does not have a lot of time and will need to get away quickly. It instructs the reader to go back to the lake, to enter the water, and to look into their eyes. It identifies the eyes as belonging to the reader's friends and classmates. It refers to a trip taken to the lake in the fall of 1975, undertaken together when the reader was young, and asks whether the reader remembers. It repeats the instruction to look into their eyes. It states that the reader can hear them speaking in the same manner they once spoke to the author of the address. It cautions the reader not to accept the framing that the experience is merely a cognitohazard. It attributes fault to the figures in the lake, insisting that they caused this and that all involved were innocent children. It states that the reader and the author alone escaped, and that the remainder are at the bottom of the lake, waiting for the two of them to return and be whole together again. It states that they want the reader to know, and that they want the reader to remember. It commands the reader to wake up, to remember the fall of 1975, described as the year they were supposed to graduate, and not to allow them to induce forgetting. It asks whether the reader can hear them calling. The question, "Can't you hear them?" then repeats across the block in descending and ascending clusters, separated by blank paragraph markers. Interspersed within these repetitions are the instructions, "Look into their eyes," and the affirmation, "I know you can." Further along, the block states that they are waiting for the reader. Later still, in isolation, appears the fragment, "We were there with them." The block closes with a final instruction, "Go back to the lake." What remains of the file, following the closing instruction, is administrative in nature. The document terminates its narrative content and yields to the residual matter appended to any Foundation record of this kind. There is no further transcript, no additional recovered fragment, no supplementary interview. The reader is left at the shore of the lake, or rather at the instruction to return there, without further guidance from the containing document itself. The file registers its position within the broader catalog by acknowledging the entries immediately adjacent to it. The preceding entry and the succeeding entry are noted in sequence, flanking this record without commentary. No cross-reference is drawn between them and the anomaly documented here. Their inclusion is procedural, a matter of indexing, and the file offers no indication that the neighboring anomalies bear any relation to the events described in the foregoing sections. The remainder of the file consists of attribution. 3 image assets are listed by file name. The first is designated warning, the second is designated as a further warning image, and the third is designated header. Each is attributed to the same author, and each is released under the same permissive license, with the source given as the Foundation Wiki. These images accompany the record in its original presentation and are noted here for the sake of completeness. The third of these images is further described as a derivative work. Its underlying source is identified as a photograph of a foggy island drawn from a public repository of freely licensed imagery. The photograph is credited to its original author and released under a license permitting unrestricted reuse. A link to the source is provided in the record. With this, the file concludes. The anomaly it documents remains at the point last described. The instruction to return to the lake stands as the final directive within the narrative body of the document. Beyond that instruction, the record offers only its own scaffolding, the quiet apparatus of citation and index by which such files are held in place within the wider archive. The reader is returned to the shore, and the document, having discharged its function, falls silent. What follows in the archive is another file, and after that, another, each holding its own contained thing at its own contained distance. What remains of the source at this point is not narrative, but the substrate beneath it. The archive, examined closely, reveals its own scaffolding. Fragments of formatting instruction, presentational residue, the quiet machinery by which a file is made legible to those cleared to read it. These are not, properly speaking, part of the anomaly. They are the shelving on which the anomaly rests. The reviewer is advised to disregard them, as one disregards the hum of ventilation while attending to the words of a witness. And yet a certain discipline of attention will note that even the shelving has been arranged. Superscript is set to hover slightly above its line. A cut color is defined, pale and nearly white. A bar color is defined, a deep and settled red. Translation blocks are marked as not to be displayed. Info containers are given their link colors, their line heights, their folded and unfolded states. Where a reader might expect a control to expand or collapse the record, the control is rendered transparent, its function preserved, but its surface effaced. In its place, drawn in white against the underlying field, a single word is set to appear, in a weight approaching the heaviest available, in a family of typefaces beginning with one and falling back through several others until something legible is found. The word is a name, or the semblance of a name, and it is the signature by which this file is marked as belonging to a particular hand within the archive. The reader is not expected to interact with this signature. It is not a link. It cannot be followed. It sits at the corner of the containment record as a mason's mark sits at the corner of a wall, indicating authorship without inviting response. Its presence is noted here only for completeness, so that no element of the document, however peripheral, is left unaccounted for. Beyond this point, the file terminates. The remaining space is given over to separators, blank and uniform, holding the page open against what would otherwise close it. The object designated within has been described. The interview conducted in its vicinity has been transcribed. The apparatus of presentation has been noted. The record, in its entirety, is now available for review. Attention now returns to the containment procedures governing the anomaly. The lake in which the object is located has been quarantined and fenced off. It is to be routinely patrolled by individuals who have not been exposed to the object and who possess no prior knowledge of its characteristics. You do not recognize the bodies in the water. Individuals who attempt to bypass the enforced quarantine are to be apprehended and transported to Site 33 for a full cognitive influence screening. Individuals who come within 50 meters of the lake containing the object are to be considered lost. A prompt is inserted at this juncture in the document. The reader is instructed as follows. Please repeat the following phrase slowly and clearly into your terminal microphone. I do not recognize the bodies in the water. A subsequent notation indicates that verification is complete and that the user is within acceptable limits. The description of the object then commences. The designation refers to an anomalous phenomenon existing within a lake, the specific name of which is redacted, in a county whose name is likewise redacted, within a state whose name is redacted. The object manifests as a group of human corpses floating in a small group at the surface of the water. A parenthetical note observes that, due to the nature of the object, it is uncertain how many individual corpses exist within the group. The number is currently estimated at 45, but has been estimated as high as 200 or more. The identities of these corpses are, in the original entry, marked as removed due to cognitohazard. An automated change has replaced this notation with the single word, unknown. DNA testing, the record notes, has been inconclusive. The reader will observe that the containment instruction and the description of the object are interrupted by the same declarative sentence. The sentence appears once within the containment procedures and is presented again as a phrase to be spoken aloud into a terminal microphone. Its recurrence is not annotated. It is not framed as commentary. It appears within the file as though it were simply another line of standard protocol, indistinguishable in tone from the surrounding clinical text. Analysis of the anomaly continues with a shift from behavioral observation to speculative theory concerning its underlying structure. While SCP-2316 appears to consist of individual instances, it is theorized that SCP-2316 may instead be an entity composed of a collective consciousness. The distinction is significant. Individual instances of SCP-2316 do not act on their own, but do seem to be able to act collectively as a single unit. At this point in the document, the clinical description is interrupted by an inserted annotation, presented in the same marginal format observed in prior sections. The annotation reads as follows: I know who they are. I know their names, each and every one of them. Don't you? The underlying text then attempts to enumerate the individual instances. The list begins, but is not permitted to conclude. The document reads that the individual instances of SCP-2316 are, followed by a partial sequence of designations that is truncated by an automated redaction notice indicating that a cognitohazard has been removed. A secondary automated message follows, stating that further editing of this passage is locked. The sentence resumes on the far side of the redaction, with the observation that the instances are unrecognizable and that the reader does not recognize the bodies in the water. The file then addresses the mechanism by which recognition is nonetheless reported by observers. SCP-2316 hosts a powerful cognitohazardous effect. This effect acts upon those who have viewed SCP-2316, those who are aware of certain parts of its nature, or those who were enrolled in a program whose designation has again been struck from the record by cognitohazard removal, with the automated system marking the reference as invalid. The effect causes such individuals to believe that the individual instances of SCP-2316 are human beings they recognize, typically from their childhood. A final annotation is appended to this passage. It reads as follows: They're lying. They know damn well who they are. The cognitohazard is real, but it's just their way of crying for help, of letting people know who they are, who they were. The document terminates at this line. No further clinical text follows the annotation. The file, as archived, ends here.